So, hi everybody, I'm Christy Craig. I'm the publisher here at Hidden Timber Books, and I want to welcome you back to another of our small press author reading events. And today I am hosting two middle grade authors, Rochelle Melander and Ann Dallman, and I'm excited to have them read and talk a little bit about their work. Rochelle, I want to start with you. And just to give the audience a little bit of information, Rochelle Melander is the author of the book Mightier Than the Sword, Rebels, Reformers, and Revolutionaries Who Changed the World Through Writing. And I want to share the picture of the cover here as well. I love book covers, and this one is a really nice one. Rochelle Melander is a speaker, writing and ADHD coach, and the best-selling author of 12 books, including Level Up, Quest to Master Mindset, and Overcome Procrastination and Increase Productivity. Her first children's book, Mightier Than the Sword, won the 2021 Sybil's Award for Middle Grade Nonfiction. She is the founder of Dream Keepers, a writing workshop that supports teens in finding their voice and sharing their stories. So, Rochelle, welcome. I'm really excited to hear you read, but also excited to talk about your work and the things that you are doing out in the world with younger writers and readers. So
awesome. Thank you. So Mightier Than the Sword collects the stories of many writers who changed the world through writing. And I'm just going to read the introduction for you. If a song has inspired you or a book has changed the way you think, you know that words can transform. If you've written a thank you note or received a kind text from a friend, you know that words can make a difference. If you've won a verbal argument or been hurt by a classmate's jab, you know the power of words. British author Edward Bulwer-Lytton said, "The pen is mightier than the sword." French ruler and military leader Napoleon Bonaparte fought with swords in multiple battles and still believed, he said, 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. But these men weren't the first to proclaim the power of words over weapons. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian sage Ahiqar taught, "The word is mightier than the sword." Many people have put this adage into action, writing books, giving speeches, and even tweeting to spread their message. In November 2010, a teen named Renee Silva tweeted to help the world understand how a drug war between police and drug traffickers was affecting the lives of ordinary people in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. In 2010, the government issued an ultimatum to the drug traffickers who ruled the streets of Renee's neighborhood: surrender or we will invade. 2 days later, soldiers marched into the community carrying rifles and setting fires to buses. The drug dealers fled to the hills. As the world watched this nightmare unfold on television and Twitter, Renee and his fellow teenage correspondents told the whole story through tweets. While machine gun fire exploded around him, 17-year-old student journalist Renee sat in his grandmother's tiny house, tweeting from a PC. Intense gunfire now in Complexo. People hanging out white cloths, calling for peace. The pizza shop is closed. Saturday night isn't Saturday night without pizza. When Renee was 11 years old, he had founded a monthly newspaper called Voz de la Comunidad, the voice of the community, to share news about the problems in his community. Tweeting helped him reach a whole new audience. By the end of the siege, Renee's Twitter account had grown from 180 to 20,000 followers. Today, his account has 377,000 followers. He has spoken around the world and was named one of the 100 most influential people of African descent under age 40. Throughout history, people have written to protest injustice, preserve culture, and imagine new futures. Young people and adults have risked their reputations and lives to propose scientific theories, declare independence, and start revolutions. Their words have changed minds, freed enslaved people, and legislated equality. This book tells their stories. Because your story matters too, each chapter includes a writing activity. You can write about the experiences, ideas, and causes you care about. The minute you put pen to paper, you change. When you share your writing, it changes others. Your words have the power to transform you and your world. Take up your pen and write.
Thank you. That's awesome. I love that line. The minute you put pen to paper, you change. I think that's a great place to begin as a writer, just to even I don't know, start that process of change. Because I think so often it's easy to assume that I'm going to write this great story and it's just going to automatically like spread like wildfire and change everyone. But it really, it has to come from your heart, and you can't really do that unless you are willing to see the sides of everything and write your passion down on paper. So that's a really great introduction. I also loved that idea of, talking so much about social media. That was one of my things as you were reading the introduction. You've got this great workshop, Dream Keepers, that I know you've done all over with Milwaukee Public Libraries. We often look at stories in a traditional way, but like you read in that intro, there's so many different ways to tell a story. And so I'm curious to know how social media works its way into Dream Keepers. Is that something that you focus on strongly, or because you're working with a younger audience who is often really solidly like connected to social media, how does that play out when you're teaching them?
But things have changed a lot over the years. When I started in 2006, their social media was not as prevalent, at least for kids. But what we did right away is I brought in, the poets and writers I knew. So I was bringing in people like Langston Hughes and Martin Luther King, and they were picking up their cell phones and bringing in modern hip hop and rap that they liked. And as, kind of things evolved and we started to see that social media was taking root, a lot of people were using social media in poetry. So we did things like headline poems, where we would take headlines from various different places and then put them together to make short haiku poems. Or we would do Twitter poems, where you just do I think it's 240 characters, 280 characters. I'm never up on this. So you do like a tweet poem. And then we do text poems. So I'm always trying to incorporate what's interesting to young people into what we're doing today. So I do like to use the old forms and the old constraints because that makes writing, anytime you introduce a constraint, writing's much more interesting and in some ways easier, because you're not just like, write whatever you want, it's just too much. But if you introduce a constraint, like you have to write a 280 character poem, or you have to write a haiku poem, or you have to write using just the headlines in today's paper, then they have to be more creative. And we're always looking for those things. But when we're in our space together and we're beginning to get back to that, we're hopefully not on social media. We're actually with each other, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's great. I agree with you that it's definitely, it's sometimes as challenging as it is easier when you have limits to what you're asking someone to write about. And just that, again, thinking about how social media works, I would assume a lot of times the kids who come to your workshop don't really think that they're writers. But yet when you start to talk about what they're already doing with their words, they are writers. It's just a matter of recognizing that and growing that creativity. So that's awesome. One more question I just wanted to ask you about your particular book, because it encompasses so many different people and their stories. And I was reading in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel the article that Jim Higgins wrote about your book. It's a great review. And, how he mentions that you had said you were beginning all this project right before COVID hit, and that you had to go to the library and check out over 100 books. Like, okay, you got to get your stock before everything shuts down. And I mean, that alone feels like, oh my gosh, how do you organize all that? But just with reading about all the people that you touch on, even in the introduction, I'm curious, when you did your research, was there anything that was really surprising when you started to dig into some of the writers? Like, I know you probably had a good plan of who you wanted to include, but did anything pop up that you didn't anticipate?
So I think with every writer there were surprises, and that was amazing. The list I started with, the list I proposed to the publisher, and the list that's in the book are very different. And the list that was in the middle of the process is different from the one at the end. So there are some authors that I started reading, and I'm not going to remember his name, and it's probably a good thing. We started reading about a poet who's very well known, but had abandoned his child. And I thought, I just, for some reason, I just don't want to include this guy in the book, because this idea that he abandoned his child just bothered me. On the other hand, then we discovered, some just amazing and interesting stories. I think, I'm always interested in people who maybe didn't do very well as kids and then succeed, because I work with so many kids like that. So I was interested in George Orwell, who did not graduate from, or who did graduate from high school, but did not make it into college because his grades weren't good enough. So he ended up joining the police in India and serving for 6 years before he just got restless and knew that he was destined to be a writer. So he came back and he, kind of did kind of like a journalist, immersive journalist experience, where he wanted to live like a poor person so he could write about them. Another one is Charles Darwin, who just skip school all the time, would often leave school, and it was not far from his house. It was a boarding school, but he didn't stay there. And he was disgusted by all the boys and the smell of dirty socks and the chamber pots under the bed. And so he would escape, and his brother had set up a chemistry lab in their backyard. And so they would make all these crazy experiments. And he ended up getting the nickname Gas, because he and his brother made laughing gas when he was in school. So those are the stories that I found that were really just so intriguing. I had about 800 words for each chapter. So you can imagine I left out just big swaths of people's lifetimes.
Maybe there's going to be a Mightier Than the Sword take 2 to fill in
Yeah.
some of this. Well, thank you. And we'll come back to you when we come back together. So, Anne, I'd like to move on to you. Let me pull up your cover of your book as well, which again is a beautiful cover. So let me tell you guys a little bit about Anne Dallman. She is the author of Katie and the Bear Necklace, which is the winner of the Midwest Book Award and the State History Award. Anne Dallman has won numerous awards for her writing and has presented her work at national conferences. A former teacher, she has written for Marquette Monthly, Country, Farm and Ranch, Winds of Change, and more. She was the writer and organizing force behind the book Sam English, The Lifetimes and Works of an Artist, and that won the 2009 Peak International Award. So Anne and I met in Upper Michigan. We were at a really fun little authors event during, I think it was nearing, gosh, I can't remember, COVID time is like, where are we? When did it start? When did it end? But it was during that time, near the end of it, when this bookstore, the Falling Rock, hosted a few authors in the UP, and I had an opportunity to meet Anne there, and it was really fun. It's if you've never been to the UP, it's a great place. If you've never been to the Falling Rock, it's a beautiful little bookstore with a lot of great books about the Indigenous culture and a lot of books written by Indigenous authors, and a lot of books about the history of the UP, which is very, very rich. So I'm super excited that you're here, Anne. I want to hear you read a little bit about your book, and then I've got a few questions for you as well.
Okay. I'm going to start at the backstory. This is the book you referenced, Sam English, The Life, Work, and Times of an Artist. And in the process of visiting Sam and researching and doing all that work that goes into making a book, his brother gave me this necklace, and it's I don't know if you can see it, and I describe it in the book. And this is the little bear. And I was looking at it one day and I thought, you know, there must be a story behind that. And I've spent 15 years teaching on the Potawatomi Reservation in Hannahville, which is Wilson, Michigan. And I taught high school English, grades 8 through 12. And my students were always, you know, why aren't there any books about us? Would you write a story that's about us? And so I started playing around with that idea, and this is the result. Now, Caddy is a 13-year-old girl of Native American heritage. She's experienced major changes in the past year. Her father's marriage to a younger woman, a new baby brother, and a move from Minnesota to Michigan, where she attends a reservation school for the first time. One school day, Caddy finds an eagle feather on the floor outside a classroom and reports it to the principal. And this is shocking. He would never, ever disrespect an eagle feather in that way. When thanking her for this act of honor, the principal tells her that a mystery might soon appear in her life. Later, Caddy discovers this antique Indian beaded necklace hidden under the floor of her bedroom closet. Is this the mystery the principal predicted might appear? She consults with the elders, who tells her it is her job to find out why it appeared to her. And helping her along the way were her friends Irish, John Ray Shigog, and a talking blue jay. So that's the backstory to this. Now, at the school I taught at, as well as the school Caddy attends, beadwork is a very integral part of the curriculum. And the kids start in kindergarten with quite large beads and progress through their high school years to something of this intricacy. This is a barrette. This is a medallion that was given to me. And it's, well, this is the moccasins. So this I show to lead into the section I'm going to read to you. Caddy's gone to the library hoping to discover some history behind this necklace. So this is in her voice. I picked up the 3 books she'd pointed out. Indian jewelry was stamped on the cover and binding of each. I sat down on the floor and started paging through them one by one. The first book was about the history of beadwork in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The second was about earrings, bracelets, hair ties, barrettes, and ornaments for decorating dance regalia. It had pictures and photos of beaded moccasins, cuffs, chokers, armbands, and belts. Some people even beaded their eagle feather fans. The beadwork covered the bottom of the fan where the feathers were held together. Some of the designs were basic, almost plain, and some were more detailed. I pulled my sketchbook from my backpack to copy my favorite. I had started beadwork lessons and wanted to copy this pattern. I was learning to make decent stitches, but my favorite part was still drawing the patterns. My sketchbook was filled with sample designs, and now I was learning how to transfer them to graph paper using colored pencils. I liked my art classes because sketching came easily to me. Our instructor told us it was important to set goals and challenge ourselves. Beadwork was definitely more challenging to me than the art classes I had taken at my old school. I started paging through the 3rd book. It had at least 20 color photos and drawings of necklaces. 1 or 2 looked like my necklace, but when I examined each more closely, I realized that the ornament dangling from the center was an eagle or a wolf and not a bear. So I read that passage earlier this afternoon when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about. And aside from writing a good mystery story, I like to incorporate Native history. And I'm just fascinated with beadwork and its importance.
Thank you. And thanks for showing those pieces of beadwork. That is beautiful. It's really cool to think about how that is part of their curriculum. Of course, I can understand why, because it's so important to the history and the culture of indigenous peoples, but I didn't know that. So I appreciate you sharing that information. And I also love that you what instigated the story was not only your students, but this necklace. And I love stories that revolve around an object to carry the story forward. So I have a couple of questions for you. One is, I know, in your book, the dedication, you dedicate it to your students and specifically to your students, and you shared about how they asked to write a story, or they wondered why there were no stories about them. So after you wrote this book, you know, I'd love to hear about their reaction. I'd love to hear about, did it inspire them to write their own stories? What unfolded from there?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that because the second book is coming out in June, and right now it's on Kindle Vella, and it's called, I don't know if you can see this, Caddy and the Birch Bark Box, because I also am fascinated with birch bark. And I gave an advanced reader copy to one of my former students who's now working on the Oneida Reservation. And she's just sent this to me yesterday. Caddy and the Birch Bark Box is a wonderful second addition to the series. It is refreshing to read a book you can identify with that represents your people and community, especially when there were so few fiction works involving the Anishinaabe people from the Upper Peninsula. Ms. Dallman provided many historically and culturally accurate examples that will encourage youth to keep reading. As an adult, it was a strong reminder to follow the traditions we were taught, no matter where you end up in life. And this young woman is a tribal member of the Hannahville Potawatomi. And as I said, she's now working on the Oneida Reservation. But that made my heart feel very happy because it's challenging to write about a character who's rooted in a different culture from your own. I work with friends who are in that culture, and boy, they proofread for me and they copy read and copy check, and they've caught things that I never would have thought of. And I'm so grateful to them for that.
I'm glad to hear that you do that as well. I have a book, here and a little bit on paper and in a folder, that involves a character who's half Ojibwe, and it's intimidating for me to work on because it's not my culture. And so, like you, it's really important if you're writing about a different culture to be in close conversation with someone from that culture in order for it to be authentic and respectful. I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the research that you did as well. I know, and maybe that just begins with teaching at the school on the reservation.
Well, my background is as a journalist. I worked for a daily newspaper as a reporter photographer for 10 years. And my training really goes back to journalism. So as I was teaching up there, I kept everything. I kept notes on everything. I have baskets and baskets and totes full of school bulletins, school lunch menus, you name it. I kept it. And that's really helped me a lot to refer back to that. I also kept notebooks, journals of my time up there. And that was invaluable to look back. And I've kept friends, very good friends from my time there who I get together with and who do read. For instance, the Blue Jay is a central character in my book, and I referred to him as silly. And my friend really came down on me and said, no, if he is her spirit guide, he would never be silly. He might be loud, he might be noisy, but he would not be silly. So that's what I mean by little things like that, that maybe, and I should say not so little, but things that totally went over my head, I would not have noticed. I've been to a number of ceremonies. I've been in a couple of sweat lodges. I've been to marriages, funerals, and I mean traditional marriages, traditional funerals. I've been to a Sundance. There was a time in my life where I was very much immersed in the culture, and not as a wannabe, but as someone who just respected the culture.
That's really great to hear. So let's come back together, all three of us, and just talk a little bit about writing for a younger audience. And well, for both of you, I believe these are your first books for younger audience. Is that correct? As far as specifically, because I know, Rochelle, you've written some great books for adult writers who are struggling to get through their stories and things like that. But this is your first middle grade book, and Anne, this is yours as well. With you have another in the series coming along. So I'm just curious about, I don't know, what do you love most about writing for the younger audiences, and what do you love most about when you do events with a younger audience and talk about your book and creativity in writing? What are some of your favorite things, favorite moments, that kind of a question?
I love writing for a younger audience because they're so curious about everything. And what I've loved, and all of my speaking engagements so far have been on Zoom. And what I've loved about them is that I'm meeting with kids from all over the country, but they don't hold anything back. Like, they just kind of say it like it is. And my favorite one so far has been this little boy who said, I think he must have been a 6th or 7th grader. He said, so if your book is so good, how come it's got such a negative title? I was like, what do you mean? Like, how is it negative? And he said, well, you seem to be like really against, like fighting for what's right. Oh. And so we talked this through a little bit, and it sounded like what he was saying is like, Mightier Than the Sword was saying that, it's better not to fight with swords. And so I said, well, I think, we're saying the same things. It's just that I'm interested in people using their pens to fight for what's right instead of their swords. So he thought about that for a while. And so that's what I love is the kids who, come with these kind of crazy, fun, in your face questions that adults kind of hem and haw around, so that I think has been the most fun. I'm looking forward. I start library programming in the summer. And so I'm looking forward to actually getting with children again, in person, and talking to them and hearing what they have to say.
I have a little different viewpoint probably from a lot of people. I taught for, almost 25 years. And one of the parts that I really enjoyed about teaching was actually writing curriculum, which I've done for different school systems. And I did for a consortium of Native schools. And I always liked the writing of the curriculum and planning classes that would get kids interested, because gosh, you got to compete with so many other things when you're in front of them day after day after day, hour after hour after hour. And where I was as the only English teacher, they would see me in 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. So it was always challenging to think of things that would stimulate them. And well, they were stimulated, but to keep them on task. So I enjoyed the writing part. And the one thing I noticed, especially on the second book, is when I'm sitting down and writing about it, I feel like she's telling the story and I really have no control over it. Like there's this 13-year-old girl coming through me and writing. And when I first went to the editor, I got a lot of criticisms for making rookie mistakes. And I was telling my very dear friend who teaches 5th grade about that. And she broke out laughing. And she said, yeah, because that's how kids write. And I thought that was really interesting to me, because I had run-on sentences and I had ands and buts, but having sub for her in her classroom, yeah, that's how kids write. And I just found that really fascinating and enjoyable. And one of the other things, writing, not specifically for kids, but switching genres, switching from journalism, which is fact-based, inverted pyramid, and that's my training. was in journalism education. I kind of ended up teaching English as a surprise. And so becoming used to being able to fabricate some things like the characters' names or different places was very freeing, but it was also hard to break that, to break out of that. I'm so used to facts, 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 and the inverted pyramid. And now you've got to do this narrative arc in it. That was really challenging. But the end product is worth it, especially when you have kids arguing over things in the story. Like, that couldn't have happened, or I don't believe it, or getting into debates, which happened in a local 5th grade classroom. And my friend, the teacher, called me up and we were laughing about that. So that's been very enjoyable. But I think I enjoy writing in all genres, but this has been really challenging to me to go into fiction. But that's good. It's good to push yourself.
It is. Yeah, definitely. And I can imagine it would be a tough switch. What came to me as you were talking were a couple of things. First of all, I really love that affirmation that stories can induce conversations, really important conversations. And I, with kids, but also with older adults, I volunteer teach at a senior citizen living residential area. And, I only meet with them once a month, but the biggest part's not just the writing, but it's how their stories that they bring to the table, they read out loud, really spark these awesome conversations and build community and build just confidence in their own voice. And I imagine that's the same thing that's happening for both of you, either when you're teaching the kids or when you're sharing your book, and when you're teaching, Mightier Than the Sword, like all these conversations that begin to help young writers and readers hone their voices and share their stories is really the purpose of Mightier Than the Sword. And so I love that. I love that you mentioned that, Anne. And the other thing I'm interested in, maybe both of you can comment on this. You were talking about when you gave your book to the editor, and she, the editor questioned all the run-on sentences and things like that. As a writer and as a teacher and an editor myself, I think sometimes it's important to kind of, it's sort of one of those things, like, it depends. Maybe it's bad, maybe it's not bad. Because if you're telling a story from this young girl's point of view, is it really so bad to have the book read as a run-on sentence in certain parts? Because isn't that revealing a true character? And so that's my question for both of you. Where do you say, no, I really want to keep my work this way, and there's a bigger purpose behind it? And where are you willing to kind of accept an editor's feedback to say, okay, I can see the other side of it?
That's a really good question. And that's one I really struggled with. In my case, when I was kind of writing outside the character, it was more book perfect, if you know what I mean, more following the standard rules of grammar. When she's speaking with her friends, a little more loose. And there are some wonderful expressions that I incorporate, like nay. I could still hear the kids in my classroom would say, oh, that's never going to happen. Or maybe it will. Nay, N-E-Y was always a colloquialism up there. Or big ol, not big old, but big ol. And so I do include some of those things because you want to be immersed in the young girl's world. And some of that is integral to that. But on the other hand, you don't want to have it be to the point where it's distracting from the story either.
And I would say, probably the biggest challenge I had with my editors was the length. We had started thinking each chapter would be 1,200 words. And so I was writing 1,200 word essays, or probably 900 word essays. And then, of course, every chapter has some writing exercises. There's some information in it. And then once we got that laid out on the page, it was very clear that that was too many words. It was just not going to be kid friendly. So then it was 900 words, and then that was too much too. And then we got down to 800. And then it was just kind of wrestling back and forth with the editor about like, well, what are the important bits? What parts do we keep? And then how do I tell the story in a way that's going to be interesting to like an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old? I really relished the feedback I got from my editors and then from my first readers to kind of help me with that. I honestly don't think I approach writing for children any differently than I approach writing for adults, except that with this project, I was super sensitive about length. I was really sensitive about wanting to have examples and details that kids would find kind of juicy and interesting. Whereas I don't think I worry about that so much with adults, because I think adults, like one kid asked me at an event, how do you keep reading when you're bored? And that was a great question, because I said, well, that's pretty much my life. I always have to keep reading when I'm bored. I would never have finished this book if I wouldn't have been willing to like wade through a bunch of boring stuff to get to the interesting stuff. So I feel like my job as an author is to kind of put a little more of the nuggets of the interesting stuff in there, so they don't feel like they're wading through the boring all the time. And I showed them like some of these books, like on Florence Nightingale, are like 600 or 800 pages long. And so there's a lot of waiting to get to the juicy part.
Yeah, and I have probably the opposite, because as a journalist, I like to write tight, and you're usually restricted for freelance work to 1,200 words or 800 words. So I write tight, and it's like, you've got to expand that a little more, put in more detail. And I'm like, why? I told what happened. No, you've got to build in more detail work.
I've read for a lot of magazines too, so I'm pretty tight. And I thought 1,200 words was tight, but 800 words is a lot tighter.
To me, 1,200 is a lot. It is, so.
It's really interesting how form determines story, and whether you have to be pushed to write longer or whether you have to be pushed to write shorter, that becomes a big aspect of the story. And like you said, Rochelle, you don't want to write this big, long, hairy book for kids who may or may not be able to stay attentive for that long. And but yet there are books out there for young readers, like the Harry Potter series, or like the Aragon series, that they're these huge books. And my son and I read the Aragon series together years ago when he was much younger. And I mean, it took us almost a year to go through them all because they're so big, but they're so interesting. And but it's a challenge. Even that way, it's a challenge to keep a 600-page book interesting for a younger audience. So it's just really fun to kind of have that conversation and hear the different challenges from both of you when you're writing for the same audience. Very, very cool. Go ahead, Anne.
And another thing I tried to do was make sure that the information I included could be used to satisfy Michigan standards for Native studies. And I believe it does, at least for my teaching in Wisconsin, it would do that too, for these Anishinaabe tribes, to have it be accurate for that.
I wonder, gosh, I was just going to ask you a question. So when you think about the UP and, I mean, some of Lower Michigan, but really the Great Lakes Indians, it's mostly the UP, Canada, and Upper Wisconsin, around that area. Is there a favorite history book that you discovered while you have been writing about Caddy? And I apologize, I pronounced her name wrong. But is there, if you were to refer readers who might be interested in learning a little bit more about Anishinaabe culture or traditional stories, is there an author or a book that you might refer them to?
The one that came to mind immediately is called Night Flying Woman by Ignacia Booker. It's set in a much earlier time. But it came to my mind because one of my students told me he had taken it home and was reading it. And he read it with his grandmother, and she started crying and said, "That's my story." It's a really, really good book. I taught that book for a number of years. Night Flying Woman by Ignatia Booker, and anything by Louise Erdrich, like her children's, her younger books. I love her books for adults, but she's written a number of them for younger people.
Yeah, the Birch Bark series, I think.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, that's cool. I'll have to look that book up, Night Flying Woman. How about you, Rochelle? When if you were to encourage someone from one of your workshops to continue pursuing more historical men and women who really took their writing to a new level, who might you, or what would be a great book that you would refer them to? I mean, you've got a bazillion, I'm sure, because you have all those 100 and something books that you've rented from the library. But
yeah, I guess, I mean, I would encourage students to find the writer that they love the most from the book and then look for their original writings. I really loved Audre Lorde. Some of her stuff might be perfect for probably high school students, maybe a little harder for middle grade. Octavia Butler writes this amazing science fiction, and so any of her stories are wonderful. Sandra Cisneros has a couple of beautiful kind of autobiographical novels that are wonderful for readers. But what I think is great is if you find someone that you're interested in, see what they wrote. Sometimes looking at their original writing is the best thing. So I wrote about Zit Kalasa, who's a Native American writer, and she wrote her own kind of memoir. I think it's called Old Indian Stories. I think she was one of the first Native American women to publish their own book of stories. And so she tells kind of her story of growing up in her culture and then being taken to the Native American school and what that was like. And the arguments she had with her mom about being educated, because her mom had really felt like it changed her brother. And so her mom didn't want her to go. And she really wrestled even with being there. It was a very difficult experience for her. So I guess that's what I would say is go find your hero and read what they wrote.
Thank you. And thanks for mentioning that book too, Old Indian Stories. And I guess it's important to note, that Mightier Than the Sword isn't just about people who wrote nonfiction or people who wrote speeches or people, that it includes writers of fiction. And just that reminder that, again, for both of you, that fiction is just as powerful as nonfiction. So I appreciate that. I want to just bring up one quote from that Jim Higgins article that he wrote about you, Rochelle, because I think it's a really great one for any of us who are writers, young or old. At the very end of it, he had asked you your go-to advice. And you said, don't judge yourself because your best ideas are going to come from your mistakes. And you have to make mistakes to find those great ideas. I think that's an excellent piece of advice. And I think, for our closing question, maybe is, what's a mistake that you made that turned out to be the exact right thing that you needed at that particular time?
Boy, that's a great question. And I'm trying to think like a good quick story that encapsulates that. I think Mightier Than the Sword took forever. I came up with the idea in 2008 and it didn't get published till 2021. And it probably took, I came up with the idea in like 2008 and I didn't write the book proposal till 2018. And in between there, I wrote a number of novels and my write-a-thon book, which is somewhere behind me. And sometimes I can beat myself up about that. Like, why didn't you just like get to it sooner? But I felt like it needed a lot. That was a book that needed a lot of kind of simmering on the stove. So during those years, I had a notebook where I wrote down the names of people that I thought should be in the book. So I spent a lot of time kind of listening, writing down names, researching, talking to kids, asking them what they were interested in. And then I had an opportunity to pitch it, and I pitched it, and the agent didn't like it. But she liked it, and then she read the proposal and she didn't like it. And I got that over and over again. People would look at it and they'd like it, but they wouldn't like it. And I think I could have looked at every one of those kind of pitching experiences, book proposal experiences, as being a mistake. Like, well, what did I do wrong? But every one of those I've learned something from. Like the book got kind of better, more kid-friendly, more, it got more hooks. Because one of the things we think about when we're writing fiction or nonfiction is how many hooks are there, for different kinds of kids to access it. So I think in retrospect, I'm glad it took a long time for Mightier to come about, because that built in a lot of time for thoughtfulness into the process. Sometimes when things happen quickly, we don't have time to be thoughtful. And I think today, with all of the intersectionality that's happening in our world, it's important to be thoughtful about that.
Boy, that was a fabulous answer.
Yes.
To a difficult question. Again, I'll approach that. My answer will be a little different. When I first went up to the reservation to teach, it was kind of a thing that just happened because of life circumstances. I would drive each day an hour, which doesn't sound like a lot these days, but from the central time zone to the eastern time zone. So that meant I would get up before 5, get ready, get in the car and drive in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And that time Highway 41 was 2 lanes. And sometimes I would be late because I would wait to follow the county snowplow so I could get through. And I often would wonder, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through this? But I loved my job. And then repeat it the next time. So it was crossing worlds. It was crossing from my town of Menominee, Michigan into, a different world up there. It was crossing time zones. It was crossing from being in a car to then suddenly switching to being in the classroom and dealing with different demands. And I would sit at my desk and think, how did I end up teaching? All I ever wanted to do was work in a newsroom. That's all I ever wanted to do, was be a reporter. But life happens, circumstances change. And I'm just so grateful that at this point in my life, I still am able to write, and I enjoy it so much. But this book was probably, I think this is the 8th version. I threw out so many versions. I went to workshops. I worked with, writing groups, and I had to, as I said before, I had to learn a different genre. And it was really hard to break some of my journalistic habits. And again, you question yourself, why am I doing this? But it wouldn't let me sleep at night. I mean, I just kept going back to it and going back to it. And by the 8th try, and after 70 queries, I managed to get published. Thank you. I don't know, the wonderful Christine DeSmit, who some of you probably hopefully know, said, you can complain to me when you've made 75 queries. And number 70, I got it. It was a big relief. So I don't know if that qualifies as a mistake, but it's life lessons. And I think the biggest one is perseverance, just not giving up. And I mean, I make myself work at this a certain time limit every day, whether that's writing or marketing or contacting people or working with librarians. But it's a lot of work. And I think that's something that gets overlooked sometimes by myself. I'm like, man, and I was complaining to one of my sons, and he said, well, you chose it. And that, yeah, he's very sympathetic, isn't he? But he's right. I did choose it, and I don't think I'd choose anything else.
Well, thank you. Thanks for both of those stories. And thank you for those books. I think whether it's years or a sideways path that you took that you didn't anticipate, you've given young readers some wonderful books. So I appreciate you both being here. I've really enjoyed this conversation and loved hearing you read from your books. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing more from both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you.